Hey guys, what's going on? It's Ben here. I'm back again today doing another video looking at the rise and fall of the Brandon Jennings, Andrew Bogut Milwaukee Bucks. This is a continuation of the Rise and Fall series. If you've been tuning in, welcome back. If you're tuning in for the first time, this is a whole series that I'm doing. I'm examining the rise and fall of certain NBA contenders and like why they rose to be a contender and then why they fell. Or, maybe if they stayed on as a contender, then I just examine like their peak years. I think it's just fun to go back and revisit teams that may not get talked about very often or that people forget about. And so I have about 4 or 5 videos in the series already. So if you guys want to go check those out, check out the playlist that this video is on, and let's get into it. So today we'll be talking about the Milwaukee Bucks between 2009 to 13, a 4-season stretch. They had Brandon Jennings and Andrew Bogut, and they turned into a contender from what was not really a prominent contender before that. So if you want to examine this team from its first season, they were this is Brandon Jennings' rookie year, and they were, as you can see, a very good defensive team, not very good offensive team. I guess first off, I want to explain that on the bottom left, those are regular season stats. On the bottom right, playoff stats. Up top is kind of more your basic stats, and the the statistics in particular that I pulled out on the bottom are games played, minutes played, field goal attempts and percentage, same with three pointers, then free throws, then total rebounds, assists, steals, blocks, points. So on this team, they had late in the year traded for John Salmons, which was, I thought, a big key to their success down the stretch. They had traded Joe Alexander, who was basically a flop lottery pick for him, and that's a pretty good trade on their part. Besides that, you had Brandon Jennings healthy for every single game. You had Bogut healthy for most of the year, staying with Carlos Delfino. And basically, outside of Brandon Jennings and John Salmons, you had offensively just a lot of supporting pieces and a great defensive anchor in Bogut in the middle, who actually had his best year as far as statistics this year, where he had 16 points a game and 10 rebounds, which is pretty good for him, and 2.5 blocks. And, Jennings really inefficient from the field, as you can see, 37% from the field. But I think the general consensus was he's inefficient, but he's also a rookie who's very small, and he'll grow and he'll become more selective as far as his shot taking, and he will overall just become more efficient. But his spark is just so enamoring that he's a really good player, and he actually nearly won Rookie of the Year. And most people were pretty surprised when he didn't because he was quite a spark plug for this Bucks team. If you look over to their playoff performances, Jennings played actually better for himself. Efficiency went up. And John Salmons, he deteriorated offensively in the playoffs. This is like his last good season, really, I believe, if I remember correctly. And they also didn't have Bogut for the playoffs, which really hurt them. And when you consider that they lost to Atlanta in 7 games in the first round, and they didn't have who you could argue is their second or even first best player in Bogut, if they would have had him, they likely, it's hard to say, but I would think that they would have gotten to the second round if he would have been healthy and played in this series. Instead, they basically had to rely on dudes who hadn't played much for them at all during the regular season, like Jerry Stackhouse and Kurt Thomas, to play major minutes for them, which was a detriment considering the chemistry wasn't as good and they just weren't really supposed to be playing that role. Like Kurt Thomas was not supposed to be the starting center for this team. I believe he was like 35 at this age. So yeah, he really was not meant to be playing that role. The next year for this team, they actually dropped out of the playoffs again. Um, you look at this team and you say, why did they struggle? Well, um, Andrew Bogut didn't have nearly as good of a year as his year before, and John Salmons dropped off too. His efficiency went from 47% from the field down to 41. Brandon Jennings' efficiency still was really bad, and people had been saying the year before he'll improve, he'll improve. He's just a rookie, go easy. But then he still was at 39% from the field his second year, and people were kind of more starting to say like, well, is he ever going to be a good efficiency player on offense? They were eking towards probably not. Carlos Delfino really struggled from the field as well. He missed 30 games. Jennings missed 20 games. Bogut missed nearly 20 games. Drew Gooden, who was an addition, who they had been looking to get some good productivity out of, missed 50 games. Um, and overall, this team, they weren't that much different, honestly. You still had the core of Jennings, Salmons, Bogut, Delfino, Mbaamute, Ilyasova. Major differences, I guess you say, if you have to look at the year before. No Michael Redd playing whatsoever, but he was basically a non-factor the year before anyways. And they brought in Corey Maggette, who played good as like a six-man role. He's in the picture above high-fiving Boykins, and he was a good six-man, 12 points in 21 minutes a night. But as you can see, their offense was terrible, 30th in the league. Really can attribute that to Jennings' extreme inefficiency. Same with Delfino, same with John Salmons. Um, those dudes were supposed to be the leaders on this team, and they, as far as offense goes, and they were just really struggling. And defensively, still a really good team with Bogut anchoring them, but offensively, they were just putrid. And honestly, even their best players on offense, like Jennings, was essentially, efficiency-wise, a bad offensive player. And we were just before the era where efficiency really mattered that much, so they weren't really that focused on it, and they were kind of just had the mindset of this is the best we're gonna do right now. And in the bottom left, I actually put down there was a thing that was posted before this season that the Bucks put out there that said your guide to the 2010 to 11 postseason. And I just thought it was super funny because they didn't even end up making the playoffs this year, but even before the season started, they were posting a guide to the Bucks in the 2011 playoffs. The next year you look, oh, excuse me, the next year you look at this team, they again actually didn't make the playoffs. This was a lockout shortened year, but if you adjust their record to a regular record, they were 39 and 43. Actually, their offense hopped up quite a bit this year, and you can attribute that to the trade for Monte Ellis. They traded Bogut midway through the season for Ellis. Bogut had actually missed most of the year with injury, but Ellis um, came in for him. Actually played pretty good. Efficiency was decent for him. Jennings' efficiency actually jumped up again a bit, and people were getting a bit more optimistic now. The year before they had been pretty pessimistic, but this year they were getting more optimistic. He was about 42% from the field. Delfino hopped up a little bit as well. Ilyasova had a really good year for himself. They brought in Steven Jackson to replace John Salmons, who they had lost. And they also had lost um, Corey Maggette, who was another six-man for them, but they brought in Mike Dunleavy to be the answer. But again, you look at this team and you say, um, Steven Jackson plays less than half the season. Luke Mbaamute, who was a key figure for them on defense, missed 23 games. Andrew Bogut, when he was on the team, missed most of the time he was there. And I think, they were the 9th seed. I think they actually only missed the playoffs by like 1 or 2 games. And they were really pretty close to being a playoff team this year, but they just had some injuries between Bogut, Steven Jackson, and Luke Mbaamute. It's kind of like injuries that on their own don't seem like a big deal at all, but when you get them collectively, they will make the difference of, a handful of games that cause them to slip out of the playoffs. But again, defense had slipped, but offense was a lot better because Monte Ellis was a huge upgrade over who they had previously, which was basically an inefficient John Salmons. And really, the last year in this era comes to 2012 to 13, where they actually were pretty similar to the year before as far as record. Last year the adjusted record was 39 and 43. This year it was 38 and 44. They did slip into the playoffs as the 8th seed. You had a core of Ellis and Jennings, and they traded Tobias Harris early in the season, who wasn't really playing at all for them. They traded him to the Magic for J.J. Redick. As you can see, Redick played okay for them. His three-point percentage was really bad. But field goal wise, he was doing okay. Jennings, again, floating around that 40% from the field. Ellis, again, floating around the 42, 43% from the field range. Ersan Ilyasova having another good season. They had lost Steven Jackson, which hurt their offense a bit. and they still had Dunleavy and Baamute, but they brought in Sanders this year. He was kind of one of the big differences. He was pretty good defensively for them, and probably was one of the only reasons that they were good defensively, because you look at Jennings, Ellis, and Redick, and that can compete for probably the worst defensive backcourt in NBA history for a playoff team. But if you look at front court, Larry Sanders and Mbah Mute were pretty good, solid defenders. And then they played the Miami Heat in the first round, who were a 66 win team, had the big three. So they really had no chance of winning that. But if you look at their efficiency numbers and just statistics as a whole, actually played pretty decent. Everybody except for Jennings, who shot under 30% from the field, and he was their top shooter in the series, which is absolutely awful. And I believe he was being guarded by Wade a good amount during the series, if I remember correctly. So that explains it, that Dwayne Wade's a really good defender, so obviously if you're getting guarded by him and you're already a very inefficient scorer, you're going to struggle even more. And, Jennings, this guy, he never figured out the efficiency thing. I actually looked at his career stats a while back, and his career field goal percentage is something like 36% from the field, which is atrocious, honestly, because, you know, if you look at his field goal percentages during these 4 years, these were his peak efficiency years, which are terrible considering that he basically peaked at 40% from the field um, between the last season and then this season we're currently looking at. And as far as supporting pieces on this team and, why did they not make a little bit more noise in the regular season? You had only JJ Redick for so long, and prior to that, you basically weren't even playing Tobias Harris, so you didn't get much of JJ Redick. You didn't have much time for him to build rapport with the rest of the team. He was basically a non-factor in those playoffs. Um, Besides that, you're trying to replace Steven Jackson, who was a pretty good offensive player, basically from within, just with Mike Dunleavy, and hoping that he steps up, which Mike Dunleavy is an okay player, but he's not going to be a really good six man for you. And yeah, I think by the time they had kind of gotten to this part, they had pushed their chips to the center and said, we want to go all in on offense when they went with the Bogut trade. And basically, they were kind of overlooking how inefficient of a scorer Monte Ellis was. And I know I keep harping on efficiency, but it is really the key to this team's downfall. If you really want to point at it, it's that they basically went all in on being a better offensive team rather than defense when they traded Bogut. And they went all in on really inefficient, essentially bad scorers. And that's really why they weren't that very good team. I can, over the course of the seasons, they had a little bit of injury struggles here and there. But if you want to boil this team's inability to succeed down to like one thing, it's that the team fundamentally went in the wrong direction with Monte Ellis. They should not have traded Bogut for Ellis. They should have traded Bogut for somebody else. Maybe the other guy who they were almost going to get, which was Steph Curry, who is a much more efficient scorer than Monte. Because if you didn't know, that was the big discussion when they were trading Bogut was, do we want to get Ellis back in the trade, or do we want to get Steph back? And the thought was, we already have a point guard in Jennings. Monte Ellis is more ready to be on a contender and win now. So let's go with Ellis because he can help us get in the playoffs right now, which is what they wanted because they thought they had a playoff contender roster. And, for 2 of these 4 seasons they did, but overall, there's a reason that this team ended up with the worst record in the NBA like 2 seasons later. Or actually, the season after this, they had the worst record in the league. Um, yeah, so that's really all I have to say. And if you want to check out more videos in the Rise and Fall series, continue to check out the playlist. I highlight a lot of these teams who kind of get forgotten about, but were in the playoff conversation a lot back in their day. And people talked a lot about the Monte Ellis trade when it happened, and even the JJ Redick trade. That was the talk of the deadline that year at the trade deadline. Um, and I just think it's so funny to see JJ Redick in a Bucks uniform. He looks goofy. But back to the point, check out the other videos if you want. There's some interesting content, and I hope you guys have a good day. See you next time. Bye.